Jacquelyn Ottman is a native New Yorker. She's a zero waste advocate, and she's an author of several books, including 3 self-published works on her personal culinary history: Family Gatherings, 5 Recipes from 5 Generations, Connecting from a Quarantine Kitchen, My Shelter Island Pandemic Story, and Ottman and Company, Meatpacking District Pioneers, which is the story of her family's 150-year-old meat purveying firm, and of course, the topic of today's talk. She is a 5th generation member of one of New York City's pioneering family of butchers, and she's given talks about her family's firm to the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation and the Tour Guides Association of New York and the Highline Docents, among others. She spent her professional career first in advertising agencies, and since 1989, she's been pioneering the field of green marketing. She's the author of 3 editions of the book Green Marketing, and it's been a staple in college and graduate schools and been translated into 5 languages. Currently, she's focused on reducing food waste via culinary means. She's writing a multicultural and social history of leftovers with implications for policy, education, and societal interactions. She is a member of the Culinary Historian Society of New York, as I mentioned, and the Authors Guild. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, and welcome.
Thank you, Glenda, for that really nice introduction. I am so excited to be here. This is the first culinary historians group that I've addressed, and you're the ones who kept me all afloat during all those long months during COVID. So welcome everyone to Unpacking the Meatpacking District Legacy of my favorite New York City meat purveyor. Thank you so much for being here to hear my story. As Glenda mentioned, my family's business began in New York over 150 years ago, and I just love telling this story. And I think you're going to love it too, even if you don't eat meat. Now, it sounds like from Glenda that many of you have been to the Meatpacking District, and certainly you know what it's all about, and maybe you've had the pleasure to stroll the High Line. Well, when the Meatpacking District became a hot place to go around 2000, I noticed that many of my own friends had no idea what actually went on in the Meatpacking District before the boutiques, the clubs, and the galleries moved in. Butchers, slaughterhouses, retailers. No one ever mentioned the term meat purveyor or seemed to even know what one was. That, of course, is what my family's business was about. So a few years ago, I tried to fill in at least some of the gaps by telling this story. I've even written a book that Glenda mentioned, and I'm going to try. I do not know why I cannot advance the slides. I'm going to. Just figured it out. Sorry about that, everybody. You know, there's always something that has to go wrong. Okay, so this is what the book looks like. I've put everything I know into the book that you see here, which is now up at Amazon. And I put a link into the chat in case you're not the lucky winner and might want to take a look. Where there's going to be a Q&A at the end. Feel free to put in your questions during the chat, however, and we'll open it up afterwards. And if there's a question that I don't get to today, please email me at this address. And of course, I'd love to be able to give you the answer. So without further ado, say hello to my father. His name is Jack Ottman. The year is 1976. Dad is 50 years old and the president of Ottman Company, our family's business. Dad is standing in front of a portrait of his father, my grandfather. The portrait was made around 1943. He was also a Jack Ottman. This elder Jack Ottman in the portrait is the one who founded Ottman Company right in the Meatpacking District in 1918. In doing so, he was carrying on a tradition of butchering and meat purveying in New York City that started with his great uncle back at the Fulton Market in 1850. 1950. Dad worked at Ottman Company for 50 years. Now, in all due respect to him, who did so much to advance Ottman Company during his tenure and my life, some of which I'll be talking about during the presentation, this elder Jack Ottman in the portrait is going to be our hero. Here's a picture of Dad and me taken on the same day, again, July 1976. I was a rising senior in college. I went on to spend my entire career, as Glenda mentioned, as a green marketing consultant, and now I advocate against food waste. But I spent all my summers, starting when I was just 13, working in the business, as did my two sisters and our brother. As you can see on the wall behind us, there are several old black and white photographs. There were many images like these on the walls of Ottman Company. We were very proud of our history. In many ways, Ottman Company defined us as a family. We were the meat people. We'll take a closer look at some of these photos throughout the talk. Many of them have never been shared beyond the family before. Here's a more recent picture of Dad and me. It was taken about 6 years ago after the first time I gave this talk. I had just presented to the members of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. They're the folks who spearheaded the very successful, indeed unprecedented, landmarking of the Meatpacking District in 2007. The whole family was in town for my talk and to celebrate Dad's 90th birthday. It was so fitting that he was in the front row that night because a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you was actually told to me by my father as we slowly made our way home together in the car up 8th Avenue in the 5 o'clock traffic so many years ago. My story is divided into 5 parts. I'm going to start by first talking about the roots of Jack Ottman's business in the Fulton Market. I'll then introduce you to Jack Ottman's Ottman Company and the dream that propelled him. Then I'll share some relevant history about the Meatpacking District itself and introduce you to the marvelous meat purveyors and the very special role they play in making sure you get a good cut of meat every time you eat out. The highlight will be the amazing things that my family's business did with meat and how it impacted how we all shop and prepare meat in restaurants and our own kitchens today. I'll conclude with a little walk around the Meatpacking District just to give you a glimpse of what you can expect the next time you visit. It keeps changing all the time. So let's head now over to the east side of town and learn about the roots of Jack Ottman's Ottman Company over at New York City's Fulton Market. Now, the story of Ottman Company and my family in America starts with Jack Ottman's great uncle Philip, who came to New York in 1850 when he was 18 years old. This is a picture of him on the left of Philip when he was 44. He had come from a little town in southwest Germany called Meisenheim. The town records show that the Ottmans were butchers, perhaps for generations. Philip brought these old-world meat-cutting skills with him and set up shop at the Fulton Market. It was located, of course, at the South Street Seaport in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. In Philip's day, the Fulton Market handled all sorts of food, not just fish. The image on the upper right shows a game dealer about that time. I suspect this is what Philip Ottman's own operation looked like. And the undated image on the bottom will give you a good sense of what the larger Fulton Market looked like at the time. So, just like in any busy market over the centuries, people are transporting their wares through the streets. Lots of commotion, delivery vehicles. Now, before leaving, note there are no skyscrapers like the ones surrounding the South Street Seaport today, and the Brooklyn Bridge was still 25 years into the future. Now, starting in 1859, so about a decade after he got himself set up, the oldest of Philip's nephews started to arrive, followed by their mother, Margaretha, and the rest of their siblings. So 8 children, 5 boys, and 3 girls in one family. Here's an oil portrait that's still in our family of the 8 children around 1870. Their parents are pictured in the portraits on the walls behind them. As you can imagine, all 5 of the boys worked in their Uncle Philip's business as teens, just like we Ottman kids did on our school vacations. 4 of these brothers would eventually work for their Uncle Philip full-time, including, and I want you to focus on him, the little boy who is standing next to the eldest brother on the far right. That little boy was also named Philip. He was my great-grandfather, and he would later become the father of our hero, Jack. Like Philip's eldest brother, the one who was reading him the book, his name was William. I'll be talking more about William and Philip in a moment. Here's an invoice that we have in the files from Uncle Philip Ottman and Company. It's dated 1875. As you can see, the business is now located at 3 locations, number 25, 31, and 33 Fulton Market. The business is described quite simply as butchers. Now, note the spelling of the name Ottman. It has 2 N's on the end of it. That will come in handy in our story in a moment. If you look very closely, next to the steer, you can see Philip Ottman's name printed prominently off to the right. And I realize this might be difficult to make out, but in small type underneath Philip Ottman's name is the name of his eldest nephew, William. He, of course, is that oldest brother in the painting that I just showed you. The very next year, so in October of 1876, Uncle Philip, now 44, went missing. He went out on a Saturday night and never made it home. This is an image of the actual newspaper notice in my files that his eldest nephew, William, placed in a local German newspaper. In it, he offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to his uncle's whereabouts. As was reported a few days later in the New York Times, the body was found floating in the East River. According to the coroner, he was the victim of an accidental drowning. Good thing his nephew William worked with his uncle so closely. Without missing a beat, William stepped up and took over the business, renaming it for himself. Here's an invoice for the now rechristened William Ottman Company. It describes the business as wholesale and retail butchers and now provision dealers and packers. Underneath the word packers, it says steamships, hotels, restaurants, and private families supplied. Those private families, of course, were the Gilded Age Whitneys, Rockefellers, and Whitneys, who entertained in the big ballrooms in their mansions long before the social scene moved to the grand hotel ballrooms. Here's an image of William Ottman and the way his Ottman Company looked at its corner location in the Fulton Market of the 1880s. If you look carefully at the building over on the left, you can see the name William Ottman over the arched windows facing us and the words butchers and packers prominently beneath them. Here's a close-up of the front of the building. You can see the gorgeous terracotta decoration. Note, of course, the fleet of horse-drawn carriages out front, Look closely and you can see William Ottman's name emblazoned on the side. When they were teenagers, each of those Ottman boys in the painting drove carriages like this for their Uncle Philip. This is fun. William Ottman Company was one of the first businesses in New York City to have a telephone. They were the first butcher as well. Here's a reproduction of a list of the 272 subscribers to the central office of the Bell Telephone Company of New York. It was published in 1878. William Ottman Company of 31 Fulton Market is listed on the upper right under Fish and Meats as the sole meat dealer. Eugene Blackford at 30 Fulton Market is the sole fishmonger. As many of you know, these subscribers didn't actually have a telephone number. One simply called the operator and in our case asked for the butcher. All throughout the last quarter of the 19th century, William Ottman Company thrived. New York City was exploding with opportunity. Manhattan's population alone grew sevenfold between 1840 and 1910, and the market for good quality meat was exceptional. Steamships carried people and cargo in and out of what was by now one of the world's busiest seaports. The families of the Gilded Age was still throwing those lavish parties featuring the finest meats William Ottman Company and other butchers could purvey. Restaurants and hotels were opening like mad to serve shoppers, diners, theatergoers, and tourists from all over the world. William Ottman and his brothers even had a whole new bridge to admire as they traversed the streets of their market, a bridge that signified even more opportunities to come. One of those opportunities to grow William Ottman Company even further through export. In 1890, when he was 45 years old, William Ottman sold his firm to another meatman with German roots, Mr. Berenhard Beinecke. Here is Mr. Beinecke in the mid-1880s with his wife, Johanna. In the bottom corner is a picture of what I'm pretty sure were his stables, still located at Great Jones Street in the East Village. Now, Mr. Beinecke was a very enterprising businessman. In addition to owning his own meat-purveying firm called Beinecke Company, Mr. Beinecke laid claim to the largest stockyards at the Hudson Yards. He also owned several hotels, including the Plaza and the Copley in Boston. In fact, he's credited with founding America's very first hotel chain. Mr. Beinecke recognized the potential of William Ottman Company to help him realize his dream, to create a truly vertically integrated business. In fact, his obituary of 1932 lists the acquisition of William Ottman Company as a crowning achievement in his career. Now, William Ottman likely thought it was a pretty good deal too, because in merging with Beinecke, he got access to markets in Europe and other resources while continuing to operate independently. Now, William Ottman would die 5 years later, but all three of his younger brothers, including Philip, the youngest one, and some of his sons, continued to work at William Ottman Company under the auspices of Beinecke for several more years, until Philip's son, our hero Jack, made a very audacious move, bringing 30 years of Ottmans and Beineckes in business together to an abrupt halt. Whatever independence his uncles and father had under Mr. Beinecke apparently wasn't enough for our hero, Jack Ottman. Here's a picture of him with his bride, my grandmother Ava, around 1920. When Jack was 32, he decided to strike out on his own. But as the story handed down in my family goes, he had a little problem. Mr. Beinecke owned the name Ottman. So Anybody guess? In 1918, our hero, young Jack, dropped the second N from his name and founded Ottman and Company. In doing so, he not only set his firm apart from William Ottman and Company, but akin it to landing on the first page of a Google search today. He vaulted his firm atop William Ottman and Company's name in the phone book. Further differentiating himself, he set up shop right in the heart of what was well on its way to becoming the capital of the meatpacking world in New York City, the Meatpacking District. And he enlists his father as president of the new firm, signaling to the world where the Ottman Meatmen can now be located. Here's a picture of the principals standing out in front of their first location at 446 to 448 West 13th Street. My grandfather Jack is on the right, and his father Philip, that little boy in the painting, is in the middle, and the foreman named Hoffman is off to the left. Now, here's something to think about. Can anyone tell me why these men were wearing straw boaters? For safety. At any given moment, their heads would have been at least 2 inches away from a swinging meat hook. 1 year or so later, in 1919, Jack moved his business into this elegant 6-story building that was then number 29th Avenue, 1 Little West 12th Street, today. The building had been built just a few years earlier by William Vincent Astor, whose family owned quite a bit of real estate in the market area and, of course, around New York City. The story told to me by my grandmother, Ava, was that they learned there was space in the building from her father, who was the bookkeeper to Astor's father, John Jacob IV. At first, Jack rented just 2 floors and the basement, paying Astor $3,600 a year rent, plus taxes. Eventually, Jack would go on to buy the entire building from Astor's estate. This is how the building looked around 1946, all dressed up for a picture with a fleet of modern gas-powered trucks out front. On November 12, 1921, Jack threw an opening party in his new digs. Jack is in the back row on the far left. His wife, Ava, my grandmother, the one in the open collar, is sitting in the middle of the front row. His father, Philip, off to the left, now 64 years old, sitting in the far left in the derby hat. Jack spared no expense, as you can tell, on the opening, from the gorgeous display of meat and game and flowers all around them. And don't you just love the derby hats? My father told me it was very typical for butchers to wear derby hats when they got dressed up, especially at the annual cattle show over at the grounds where the new UN is now located. It's where New York City came to pick out their Christmas dinner. Look closely and you can see the sawdust on the floor, a safety measure that also helped to keep the meat chilled. Our hero Jack Ottman's new Ottman and Company was launched with style. Now, before sharing all the amazing things that Jack and his team would go on to do, and more about this exciting meatpacking district they did it in, let's spend a few moments to learn a bit more about the gorgeous buildings that you can still visit today. Jack Ottman's new building was situated right in the heart of the Meatpacking District. For those of you familiar with the area, it was bordered on the west by 9th Avenue, to the north by 13th Street, Hudson Street off to the east, and to the south by Gansevoort Street. Notice the big intersection out front of the building. Of course, it's very unusual for Manhattan with its famous grid, but not so unusual, of course, for the Meatpacking District with its funky crisscross streets, which is one reason why I think people like it so much. Here's a street view of what the buildings look like today. In the upper corner is a diagram of the block that the buildings share now with the very tall, shiny Gansevoort Hotel that looms up behind them. When it was built in 2004, it precipitated, as you can imagine, a very energetic movement to preserve the character of the immediate neighborhood and the Meatpacking District at large. They now call this intersection Gansevoort Plaza, and in that plaza you can now see Bloomberg-era umbrellas, tables, and chairs. But in our day, nobody had time to sit. This pastel, commissioned by my sister in 1981, will give you a feel for the hustle and bustle in that intersection in our day. It was painted by Camille Kubik, a Czech artist who did such a great job capturing so many city landmarks. All day long, like in all busy markets, over time, trucks whizzed by. Butchers in their long white coats raced across the street, often with hand trucks. And it was quite noisy, too. Apparently, the Belgian bricks like cobblestone, tend to magnify the sound of rubber tires as well as, historically, horses' hooves. Here's a close-up shot of the taller white building taken around 2004. When all three of the buildings had been renovated by new owners. It was designed by Lafarge, Morris, and Cullen as a 6-story warehouse to serve the market area. It's considered a lovely example of arts and crafts architecture with paired windows and a cornice that was elegantly decorated with red tile diamonds. A story I can't resist sharing. I had heard growing up that Jack Ottman put those red diamonds under the cornice because our trademark was a bright red diamond O. But I now suspect that the reverse is true, that our hero Jack, was simply inspired by those diamonds in developing the logo, since I now see these same types of diamonds on other buildings in the area, most notably at what is now an Apple store up on 9th Avenue and 14th Street. Now let's take a close-up look at the two smaller buildings off to the right. I only have a moment or two to talk about them, but they're well worth it. My father bought both of these little buildings in 1964, and he eventually combined all three into one as they remain today. But when his father, our hero Jack Ottman, moved in next door, these buildings were still occupied by Mittendorf and Rohr's Company, a wholesale grocery firm owned by Henry Mittendorf and Hermann Rohr's German immigrants like his own family. Chances are the owners initially at least lived above the red building, which was built in 1887. Notice the beautifully decorated cast iron columns out front, downstairs. The company built the larger annex in 1919 in a similar style. Before we move on, take a close look at the little red brick building. When the facades of all three of the buildings were cleaned in 2004, it revealed the ghost of the name Mittendorf and Rohr's Grocers painted across the front. It's so stunning. I encourage you to make sure to take a look the next time you're in the neighborhood. And one last architectural stop, starting in the 1960s, we rented this building diagonally across the intersection at number 52 Gansevoort Street. It housed our bookkeeping departments and mailroom, and it's where I mostly worked as a teen. It's representative of many of the low-slung neighborhoods all around the neighborhood. This particular one was built in 1853 as one of the many tenements to house the people who worked in the factories that were in the area before the meatpackers moved in. And like many other in the neighborhood in the 1930s, it lost a top floor or two and gained a metal canopy when it was converted for market use. back to Jack Ottman. Jack Ottman grew his business into a powerhouse in the tall white building, an industry leader with the customer list to prove it. Here he is pictured in March of 1942, hosting a gathering of the Metropolitan Branch of the International Stewards and Caterers Association upstairs on our 4th floor. His giant arm is wrapped around one of his guests. Can you guess he was a natural salesman? And because you're in Michigan, I'll mention that you won't be surprised to learn that, as my father recalls, Jack drove a dark green, custom-built 12-cylinder Zephyr back in the day. He was quite a character. I'm proud to say Ottman Company was chosen to supply the Bermuda Conference of April 1943, and some of Jack Ottman's customers, like those of the previous Ottman Companies before it, including some of the best restaurants in New York, including Lushow's, The Palm, The Four Seasons, and 21. A real feather in his cap, Jack Ottman's Ottman Company was the exclusive supplier to Henri Soulet's storied LePavillon restaurant. As some of you may know, LePavillon evolved from the French Pavilion, one of the biggest sensations at the 1939 World's Fair. Here are 2 images of the very exacting proprietor, Henri Soulet. On the upper left, he's checking details in his famed crystal room, and on the right, he's conferring with his captain and chef, 2 of whom included Pierre Franey and Jacques Pepin. To quote the Times, customers could count on Soulet and his team to serve authentic haute cuisine, served just as it was done in France, with no shortcuts, no concessions to American expectations. According to the Times, under the auspices of the exacting Soulet, it is considered to have defined French food in the United States from 1941 through 1966, and it spawned so many other Le's, La Goulou, La Côte Basque, and La Caravelle among them. Here's the menu from LePavillon. Sorry, it's a bit hard to read. It's probably worth, of course, an entire talk of its own. Ottman's meat was turned into classic dishes, all served impeccably. Pardon my accent. Steak au poivre with a celery braise, foie de veau au bacon, noix de veau fermière, and each entree was complemented with sides of petit pois français, haricots au beurre, and courgette provençale. Now, of course, I don't have time to describe more about the dishes, nor can I say I've exactly eaten them by myself, but don't they all sound absolutely fabulous? Now, before moving on, as a former marketing person, I can't help but comment on the fact that neither Ottman Company's name, nor its Diamond O logo, nor the names of any of its competitors ever appeared on Pavillion's or any other customer's menu. Ottman and all the other meat purveyors were the secret sauce, but very much the unsung heroes behind the scenes of the world's best restaurants. Now, just like we're experiencing a wave of celebrity chefs now, perhaps in the future we'll see celebrity purveyors. I'm starting to see some names on menus like Coleman Ranch with their natural meats, and Shake Shack mentions Pat LaFreda, but it's still a very rare thing. Sadly, in late 1943, Jack Ottman died unexpectedly, and right at the height of World War II. As you can imagine, it was not only a shock since he was just 57, but for the business, it was a very challenging time to lose one's founder, especially in the meat industry, in which meat was being rationed to feed the troops. The good news is that Ottman Company not only made it through the war, but Jack Ottman left behind a legacy and a management team that would help to fulfill the very big dream he had for his firm. That dream, to sell meat, not off hooks, but packaged 12 to a box, just like Barasini chocolates. The team was first headed up by my grandmother Ava, whom you can see here at the head dinner of a table that she held for our management and sales team around 1946. Nanny, as I called her, was assisted by an outstanding number of primarily men who served their entire careers with us. It included my father, to her right, our left, and my Uncle Henry, my father's twin, second from her left, who died in the late 1960s. Over the next 56 years, this team, later assisted by my sister and brother, who worked for the firm full-time when they graduated college, would grow Ottman Company to $15 million in revenues and employ 135 people. So a small business by today's story, but one with a big story to tell. To help you appreciate what made Ottman so unique, first, I just want to spend a little more time learning more about the Meatpacking District, that wondrous gem of a neighborhood outlined in blue on the map of New York City's above Greenwich Village, which is famous all by itself. I'll give you a sense of how the Meatpacking District came to be and how it worked, and then I'll give you a little more details about what a meat purveyor actually does. But first, I want to tidy up the story of the Meatpacking District's very name. Believe it or not, we never called it the Meatpacking District. New York City loves its flour, its financial, and its garment districts, but I suspect the term Meatpacking District was coined by the media or perhaps the real estate people once the area started to become trendy, but not by the people who actually worked there. We all referred to it simply as the market, and for good reason, which I'll explain in a moment. But long before it became a meat market, it was a market of another sort, an Indian trading post. The first inhabitants of the so-called Meatpacking District were the Lenape people, who set up a trading post in the area. As depicted on the map, they lived up and down the Atlantic coast as far south as Delaware. They cut a trail through lower Manhattan to the Hudson River, a trail that one source believes went right across the island occupied by the Ottman buildings and the Gansevoort Hotel. There's even a commemorative for it at Astor Place. The Lenape were followed in the area by the Dutch, who planted tobacco through the area we know today as Greenwich Village. Then, during the War of 1812, the area served as a military fort. It was named after Peter Gansevoort, who served as a colonel in George Washington's Revolutionary Army. This is fun. He later became the grandfather of Herman Melville, who coincidentally worked as a young man as a supervisor at the Hudson River docks. And finally, in the 19th century, the future Meatpacking District became home to many small manufacturing firms, some of which were still there when I was a teenager. Now, starting in 1884, 2 acres closer to the Hudson were designated by the city as a public market. It was originally called the Farmers Market. Farmers came by ferry from all over the metropolitan area to sell their produce to the general public as well as commercial customers. 3 years later, it was renamed the Gansevoort Market after General Gansevoort and the fort, which was by now buried deep under the market and discovered many years later. In 1888, the city then built the 10 big red brick buildings just behind the Gansevoort Market, you see here, to house meat, poultry, and dairy businesses. That area was called the West Washington Market. Here's another aerial view from 1904 of the Gansevoort Open Air Market and the West Washington Market back behind it. Can you see way over to the left a big white windowless building? Up at the top, it says Manhattan Refrigerating Company. For the first time in history, New York's meat, dairy, and poultry business could take advantage of something that wasn't available at the other city markets: refrigeration. It had just been invented in the latter part of the 19th century, and the Manhattan Refrigerating Company sprang up to supply refrigeration to all the food businesses in the market. And they did it by circulating brine through a very innovative system of pipes that they had built under the streets. The brine was cooled by thousands of gallons of water from the Hudson River. Incidentally, I suspect those pipes are still under the streets. Now, a good question to be asking just about now is, from where did the meat businesses in the market get their meat? I don't see any pasture land around. Are you sitting down? Most of the meat that came into the West Washington market originated from the stockyards at 39th Street on the far west side. They were located, so the Meatpacking District is below 14th Street. They were located right next to the Hudson rail yards. Here's a picture of cattle arriving in New York City for slaughter around 1959, right where the Javits Center is now located. No kidding. Some of the cattle were transported across the Hudson by barge from New Jersey and Philadelphia. The rest were brought in by rail cars from stockyards in Chicago and Omaha and other points Midwest. As you know, meat is extremely perishable, so throughout history, cattle historically had to be located close to market so the meat could be eaten soon after slaughter. What will also surprise you is that a lot of this activity, and I hope I'm not being too graphic here, was actually done under the ground. These undated black and white drawings show the 39th Street abattoir and the very grand Gothic-looking building and pier up to the right, up to the top left, in which the cattle were received. Starting in 1934, the meat was transported down to the West Washington Market in refrigerated rail cars on a special spur of the New York Central Railroad. Here are some views of what was called the West Side Freight Elevator. It was built under the aegis of Robert Moses, and it only carried freight, no passengers. In those days, it made its way from the Hudson Yards at 35th Street straight through to Spring Street, just north of Canal Street. As you can see, it snaked its way right through many of the buildings delivering meat and other provisions. It was designed to be 35 feet high, so it would bypass the heavily congested streets. The West Side Freight Elevator served the Meatpacking District until 1980. In 2006, of course, it was rejuvenated as a park, which you all know so well as the High Line. The meat was delivered to the warehouses of meat packers and wholesalers with still familiar names like Swift, Armour, and Wilson. Super early in the morning, the buyers would go into the market and select the cuts of beef, veal, lamb, and pork that had just the right marbling and other characteristics. One of those buyers in the 1940s and 50s was my father. Here he is as a young man with his boss, Don Vitolo. In 1946, when he had returned from serving in World War II, Dad started as the junior buyer at Ottman Company. Now, can you see that the buyer in the main picture is holding something in his left hand? That is a little branding iron of sorts, except it wasn't hot. The one my dad brought to the market had our firm's Domino logo on it. Just like this buyer, Dad would whack that Domino logo right into a big slab of fat, and the sellers would know which meat to deliver to our firm later that day. The meat would be delivered to the receiving department under the metal canopy on 9th Avenue. And it would be immediately weighed on the scales you see here. Then it would be moved into coolers before it would be cut down further according to the specifications of our customers. Now, here's a fabulous photo I thought you'd love to see of the buildings in the West Washington Market in 1936, and the picture was taken by Berenice Abbott. In its heyday in the 1920s and 30s, when our hero Jack Ottman was thriving, there was an estimated 150 to 250 meat businesses in this West Washington market. By now, it was firmly established as the center of the meat industry in New York City, and as you can imagine, a very important source of jobs, and one of the ways that New York City grew in importance all around the metropolitan area. Increasingly, many of the businesses in the market, including our own, were what eventually became known as meat purveyors. Here's a peek inside some of the meat purveyors that still operate in the market today. They cater to what is called the away-from-home market. They buy meat from wholesalers and fabricate it into steaks, chops, roasts, and other cuts according to the demands of their customers. These meat purveyors still use the same old-world hand-cutting techniques passed down for centuries from their fathers and grandfathers. Restaurant kitchens are so small, so the meat purveyors also age a lot of the meat on their own premises for their customers, likely for 3 weeks or more. And some of it may be fabricated into special blends of ground meat. Pat LaFreda, the purveyors behind the burgers at Shake Shack, claims to make 100 different combinations of ground beef, veal, and pork. Now, you may not have been familiar with the name meat purveyor, at least my friends in New York way back when weren't, but you know meat purveyors' customers well. The hotels, restaurants, cruise ships, airlines, cafeterias, executive dining rooms, catering halls, and all the establishments that serve a meal outside of the home. The meat purveyors who are still in the market today cater to some of New York City's favorite steakhouses like Peter Luger's and the Old Homestead, who themselves have been around for decades. They also sell to many high-end restaurants and steakhouses. All of them simply want their meat cut the old-fashioned way and are willing to pay the price. Of course, more and more of them now want to make sure their meat is sourced locally. The purveyors who are still in the market share a building called Gansevoort Market Meat Center. The center is a cooperative that was built by the city in 1949 on the site of the old West Washington Market close to the Hudson. Here's a few more views of the meat center. You can also see it has a large inner courtyard that purveyors use as a loading dock, and they operate just under the High Line. So a great juxtaposition between the old and the new, as so much of the Meatpacking District represents today. The meatmen who work in the Gansevoort Market Meat Center still arrive at 4 a.m., if not before, just like my father and grandfather did. Many of them grab breakfast in Hector's, located just under the High Line. So if you want to see real meatmen when you go to the Meatpacking District, go to Hector's. I doubt, however, that any of them get a breakfast chit worth 25 cents like my father told me about, which used to be enough for a plate of lamb chops and eggs. During all of its early years, right through World War II, Ottman Company followed the same model as their meat purveyor colleagues in the market, like I've just described, until the needs of our customers propelled us along a different path. Our business had evolved to accommodate customers way outside the metropolitan area, sometimes on the other side of the world. So now let's explore what these needs were and some of the amazing things we invented to meet them. Along the way, you'll discover how our pioneering ways impacted how we all shop and prepare meat in restaurants and our own kitchens today. In the years after World War II, W.R. Grace and Company introduced Cryovac, a vacuum package that significantly extended the shelf life of fresh meat. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this package. In the process, it helped to revolutionize the meat business and the entire meatpacking district along with it. Cattle no longer had to be transported to stockyards by rail. The packers could slaughter and dress the meat right where the cattle were raised, way out on the range. The fat and bones stayed behind, allowing just the saleable meat to be transported to market in these airtight vacuum-sealed bags instead. So, starting in the 1960s, with the help of Eisenhower's federal highway system, meat increasingly came into our plant not from the local wholesalers, but directly from the Midwest, packed in Cryovac. It was transported in boxes like you see here, stacked high in one of our chillers. It was delivered by drivers, still called Teamsters, who drove refrigerated 18-wheelers all night long. They arrived at our receiving department early in the morning. Not surprisingly, this innovation was known in the industry as boxed beef. At the same time, the restaurants, hotels, and cruise ships found expert butchers in short supply. So they needed meat that was already cut. They didn't want some other things too, like meat going bad, causing health problems. They didn't want their customers ordering a 12-ounce steak and getting something less. And importantly, they wanted to be able to control their meat costs, which of course was always the most expensive item on their plates. So Ottman Company innovated around these needs and pioneered a brand new concept, frozen portion control meat. In the process, we contributed to what became massive transformation in the away-from-home market. Here's how it all happened. So first, the expert butchers, or more accurately at this stage of the meatpacking process, the fabricators, trimmed the meat as you see here along this conveyorized boning line. Then the meat was cut with a band saw, as you see here. This gave us uniformly sized steaks and chops. What's not pictured is that before it was sliced with the band saw, the larger piece of meat would have been compressed at 200 pounds per square inch in what was called a Becher press. This helped to even out the irregular shape of the larger piece of meat. Some of our meats were also tenderized with a special process that we, of course, called Ottmanizing. My father and his team helped the French inventor André Jacquard perfect the machine you see here on the left and in the color insert. It relied upon a multitude of needles instead of chemicals to mechanically tenderize the meat. Of course, you can buy one of these devices for your kitchen today. Then the step process of freezing the meat would begin. Now, we all know that freezing meat at home doesn't always turn out so well. So we at Ottman had to invent something new. And we found the best resources in the world to work with. First, we vacuum packaged our individual steaks and chops in a special type of airtight package like the one you see here. Vacuum packaging helps to prevent freezer burn, and it keeps food fresher for longer. It also helps to preserve the meat's pink color. The Cryovac package that I showed you earlier was suitable for fresh meat, but this one was designed to protect meat during freezing. It was called Bievac, and it was made by DuPont. It's now called Sirlin. Another expert on the team was none other than Clarence Birdseye, the inventor who perfected the art of freezing vegetables back in the 1920s. Dad told me that Clarence Birdseye was inspired to freeze food after seeing an entire fish that had just been caught freeze on contact with a sheet of ice. You probably knew that too. To replicate the process of freezing fish on contact, Birdseye invented the device you see here. It was known as a contact plate freezer. The individually packages of meat would be loaded onto the metal shelves. The shelves would contract and tighten around the meat, and a refrigerant coursing through those shelves at 60 degrees below zero would freeze the meat in 2 seconds flat. Freezing meat this way, quickly and protected by that package, quickly captured the meat at its optimum point of freshness. And compared to traditional methods of preserving meat like salting or curing, freezing doesn't alter the meat's taste. Customers thought this was a pretty good idea. It helped them to control their costs, was much more convenient, and helped them to cut down on waste. Another innovation was a line that we called Chef Ready. Over time, many of the customers wanted to stop hiring chefs as well as butchers altogether. So Ottman Company pioneered a line of pre-cooked roasts packed in their own roasting bag with a Done Right brand thermometer that popped up to let you know it was done. Sound familiar? With this technology, customers could keep their costs in check because someone other than a trained professional could do the job. This may be my favorite slide. A final step in our process, all of Ottman Company's meat went through a metal detector. It's a precaution we took in response to a phone call that we received from our customer at American Airlines. He informed us that a passenger in first class had found a bullet in his steak. We can talk more later what might have been the likely cause for said bullet, but Dad told me that over time it was much more common for more benign items like the occasional paper clip to get picked up along the way. So Ottman, ever protective of its reputation, didn't take chances. Thanks to the advent of shipping containers, Ottman Company was able to export its brand of frozen portion control meat to 27 countries. My sister Charlene was in charge of that department. During the 1970s, when the Middle East was flush with oil money, it was not uncommon for us to ship 47,000 pounds of the finest beef in America to Saudi Arabia every other week or so. It would arrive 30 days later in superb condition. It made quite the meal for Saudi princes who otherwise feasted on lamb, goat, chicken, and camel. Here's a picture of Mr. Jimmy Smith. He was Jack Ottman's right-hand man and extremely helpful to my grandmother when she took the helm during the war. Mr. Smith is showing off cartons of our final product, chops, steaks, patties, cutlets, and an item we invented and imaginatively named called Steaker Barbs. It's time to channel our hero here. I'm thrilled to say that every one of these items are packed like my grandfather Jack Ottman dreamed, 12 to a box like Barricini chocolates. To conclude, as many of you know, the Meatpacking District experienced a long-term decline beginning in the 1960s right through the 90s when the area started to transform after the clubs and the crime moved in. The number of meat businesses in the market dropped from 160 firms in 1974 to barely half that 20 years later. And now, of course, we're down to 5 or 6. Some other meat purveyors are still around today. They've moved to Hunts Point Market in the Bronx or to New Jersey, but many others decided to call it a day. I think the biggest reason for the decline was the consolidation of the meat industry, a trend we're seeing in so many other industries and one that became so clear during the pandemic. Today, just a handful of firms crank out millions of pounds of meat per day in huge automated plants like this one in the Midwest. In 1985, my brother John moved our firm to Massachusetts in order to get economies of scale and production efficiencies that we couldn't achieve in a 6-story vertical building. To his credit, over the next 14 years, John and his partner grew the business significantly. But in 1999, 109 years after William Ottman was acquired by Beinecke, a much larger business acquired ours to satisfy their own needs to increase scale. So, Jack Ottman's Ottman Company, like those of his predecessors, his great-uncle Philip and his uncle William, all rich in history, are sadly now history. So far, no members of the 6th and 7th generations of Ottmans here in America are showing any signs of interest in carrying on the tradition. And as a 5th generation member myself, all I can claim is the role of self-appointed storyteller. Nonetheless, all of us Ottmans are very proud of what we accomplished and the legacy that you yourselves experience directly or indirectly whenever you dine out, shop, and cook in your kitchen. Life moves on, and so must we all, including the Meatpacking District. Like many of the buildings in our area, ours are now home to new kinds of tenants. Bagatelle, a fancy brunch place, is located on the main floor of our big white building, right where we had a very big walk-in freezer. And up until recently, throughout the building, freelancers co-worked where we all once simply worked. The low-slung building that we rented across the intersection at 52 Gansevoort Street was at one point converted into a trendy food hall, fittingly named Gansevoort Market, and has since been relocated to 9th Avenue and 14th Street. Now the building is the new home to Pastis, a French bistro that was one of the first posh restaurants in the Meatpacking District when things turned around in the late 1990s. After a 5-year hiatus, it recently reopened in the building where we once housed a bookkeeping department and a mailroom. And one final evolution, the R&L restaurant where we picked up coffee in the morning, eventually became home to Florent, a chic hangout, and now it's a trendy clothes store. But whatever it is now, and whatever it may become, it will always nod to the R&L restaurant where so many meatpackers grabbed their breakfast so many mornings ago. If my story has any themes, they are change, innovation, and the power of entrepreneurial spirit. It's now up to new generations to address new needs, like how will we feed the billions of more people that are expected on our planet? And what role, frankly, will meat as we know it today play in that process? The Meatpacking District, with its funky streets and its ability to cradle the past and the present, has been able to transform itself from a Native American trading post, a military fort, a farmer's market, and a meat market. After decades in decline, it is now home to galleries, boutiques, and Tony restaurants. Who knows what's next for the Meatpacking District, or what it will even be called? But whatever it is, I wouldn't be surprised if the creative, enterprising, and industrious people it will attract, with an appreciation for tradition and an eye on the future, are already at work on the answer. Thank you so much for listening. It was an honor to tell you my story.